And I want to start by thanking the Kelly Writers House. So this event was hatched out of a conversation with Al Philrace. I mentioned to him that I'd kind of returned to the thinking again about this book, and he said, "Cool, Dictée Day," and that's what we called it for a while until Jessica said, "Let's call it On Dictée." And then Jessica Lowenthal made everything happen as she always does. Thank you so much. Thank you, Heidi Kalu, for making the announcement, and to Allison Katz and Zach Carduner, and of course the rest of the Crack Writers House team. So before I ever read Theresa Kyung, I visited her gravesite. So she's buried near my grandmother. This is outside of like Half Moon Bay. And my aunt showed me to Cha's headstone when we were at the cemetery. So my aunt had been given a copy of Dictée by Korean church members, and maybe because of this, I was very wary about reading the book. And that was, that was a moment when everyone, it seemed, was discovering it. So this was in the 1990s in graduate school at Berkeley. But then I opened the book and it possessed me. And I, in turn, possessed Dictée. I just have this, I remember feeling personally affronted when someone called it a novel. But no one will do that today, especially not this panel. Okay, so legions of readers possess this book. All of us here, each of us jealously guards it, and we are all haunted by Saint Theresa Kyung. So I am a lay reader of Dictée, but I have the privilege of presenting a panel of true poets. So Julia Bloch, Laynie Browne, Elizabeth Kim, Jena Osman, and Syd Zolf. So as we all know, they're local luminaries. They are theorists, interlocutors, a filmmaker, and they just seem to nab Pew Fellowships, among many other awards. So I am lucky to insinuate myself into this assembly, and I have the true fortune of their friendship, which is the best part of this event. And now, lucky for all of us, they will share their dictées. So the riffs we're going to do in the order of the book, so that's how people are coming up when they come up. And then after, we'll just have a chit-chat, Q&A. We're going to turn our chairs around, I discovered. Okay, Laynie.
Thank you, Joe. It's on. So this riff is called Breathing Punctuation in Cha's Dictée. Open paragraph. It was the first day. Period. She had come from afar. Period. Tonight at dinner, comma. The families would ask, comma, open, quotation marks. How was the first day? Interrogation, mark, close quotation marks. At least to say, the least of it possible, comma. The answer would be, open quotation marks. There is but one thing, period. There is someone, period. From afar, period. Close quotation marks. When I first read Dictée, I learned an entirely new grammar. I learned upon first contact that the parts of speech and how we employ them aren't separate from the precarity of existing in a breathing body. Freedom to come and go as ourselves in paragraphs. The cost of that differs greatly from person to person, location and time, positionality. However, everyone is subject to some degree. You may experience yourself as never or always the subject of someone else's constructed sentence. What happens when how we speak and write are scrutinized and curiosity becomes an interrogation mark as opposed to a question? What happens when expression is codified and controlled? Rupture, colonization, intergenerational trauma, displacement, being removed from one language and having others thrust in the mouth. In dictée, syntax and punctuation become forms of resistance, new literary formal devices, hybrid expressions of translation, fiction, diary, history, mythology, a collage of image and text, also a series of writing exercises revealing the barbs of constricted, tyrannical pedagogies. Movement requires breath. For a writer, breath is also ink, image, utterance, the ability to intone, to sound, to move the mouth and fingers. Cha's dictée illuminates how one's language can be bound and then unbound. Reading dictée, I wonder, what is another word for masterpiece which does not contain the word master? Not to skirt the oppressive structures and inequities relayed in dictée, but to demonstrate that even the language of superlatives does not stand up in describing such a text. In dictée, we can't not be aware of the problematization of language. Dictée relays an emptying of words and what they are supposed to mean as only one layer of meaning. What is meaning all along? What is language when it is in the context of taking dictation along the seam of any image or page? Here are some more questionable words: monument, model, and standard. Saying these words aloud, I'd like to undo them and propose dictée as an anti-categorical text. With a book which points to how all language is politicized, mirroring power structures, how not to second-guess any words which come alongside Cha's primary words in the hopes of saying, this is what this book is like. In dictée, we see the way language itself is suspect. Dictée calls us to our attention that the acts of reading and writing are not transparent, like drinking a glass of water. Language learning is not unbiased, is not an innocent traipse across a city, a century, or a lane. These acts claim power, and when suppressed, suspended, or revoked, when agency has been extracted, then the very acts of reading and writing against become transformative acts for the artist, and then again for the reader, viewer, and listener. Problematic systems, devastating orders must be illuminated, and one way in dictée is to use such structures to illustrate constrictive mechanisms. The way language is chosen and systematically taught, the composition notebook, the act of dictation, all these can be subjects in themselves. Inhalation and exhalation, pencil marking and pen stroke provide somatic ways to observe and to begin any history. Of course, upon first reading dictée, much of what I've just recounted was not yet conscious. Instead, I experienced an unfastening and stepping out of something I could not name. I had no words. The words were all in dictée. It takes time to read and reread dictée, much longer than a detective novel or even all the volumes of autofiction. You might ask, why should we take this time? Why is difficulty necessary? Why would anyone refuse to write transparently like a glass of water? You might only want a book you can drink and see through in the light. Are the most important moments of your life like that? easily given, unclouded, effortlessly represented by a linear, straightforward narrative? And what about the history of any single human life? A pause is language. Silence is language. The inability to speak is language. Instructions given, forced recitation is language. Resistance is language. A refusal to explain is also language. It murmurs inside. It murmurs. She waits inside the pause. Inside her, she would take on their punctuation. There is a they imposing. A they rhymes with pain, as in inside is the pain of speech, the pain to say. How many entrances guide us into Dictée? The first, cover, photograph, stones, barren, a tomb. Next, a stone wall with Korean text translates, Mother, I miss you. I am hungry. I want to go home. Scanned and reprinted multiple times. More entrances, a dedication to my mother, to my father. The epigram from Sappho reads, May I write words more naked than flesh, stronger than bone, more resilient than sinew, sensitive than nerve. The multilingual simultaneity affords multiple entrances in Korean, French, Greek, English, in language of image and line. What makes words naked, resilient, alive with nerves? When asked to relay, to take direction, to observe and replicate convention, a choice evident in Dictée is that the prescribed conventions of language, how it is taught, learned, and transmitted, can be rearranged, can be refused, can be subverted, that a voice can stutter, singe, resound, and inscribe a process, becoming aware and thus making the reader aware of systems of meaning-making, a systemic, oppressive, inherently invisible structures. This is also an aperture. Dictée is a book that returns me to a series of questions. What is reading? What is required of a reader of such a text? What is genre? What is understanding? A transactional notion of reading would be as follows. We read a solicitation, a letter requesting our action. The action desired of us may be buried in a nest of polite language, but one can discern it, pull it out. We act, or we don't, but we're done with reading. And then there is the kind of reading which serves a different function. We arrive at a text. The only way is word by word, and again, slowly, in the case of Dictée, we finish only to begin, flipping back and forward. Something else is required, and when this something else cannot be decoded, discerned, or summarized, we may eventually give up and decide to spend time with the text. This showing up with nothing to get, no pretext, and even before context is an invaluable ask, which allows a lingering. One suspects there must be ways to confront personhood in writing, even when confronted with conditioning such as write clear sentences, don't obfuscate, commands to forget, write in another language now. Obliteration, having passed to other ways discouraged, wiped out, or punished. Erasure, and begin again and again the role of repetition and alteration. What of the speaking silences? There is a we implicit in being trained, and this we, consisting of youth and educational institutions, are often dictated to. Trust is inserted into the process of receiving dictation. What happens when Cha gives to the reader her own dictation? This is the brink of this book, where attempts at speech, not editing out the difficulty of utterance, replace silence. Thanks.
Okay, I'm moving a little bit farther in the prefatory material, and this is the Catholic Mass in those pages, and it's the Ash Wednesday Mass, which, as you know, marks the first day of Lent, the period of penance toward restoration to the sacrament. I'm not Catholic. I didn't grow up Catholic. I grew up Methodist, actually, and not that I'm very Methodist, but so this is, yeah. Okay, so black ash from the palm, Hosanna, ash. Kneel down on the marble, the cold beneath rising through the bent knees. Close eyes, and as the lids flutter, push out the tongue. This is the ritual to receive him. And then black dot of ash on the forehead. Through Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Through the mea culpa, through my most grievous sin. So this is about him and sin. But the first translation exercise is not about him. Here. Today would be the feast day of the Immaculate Conception. She would have been voted to crown the Blessed Virgin. She herself would be sinless and would be pure, would be chaste in her heart. She would be silent often, most of the time, most often than not, far too often. So the feast day, I looked this up, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception celebrates Mary and not the conception of her son. The Virgin Mary was redeemed from the moment of her conception, even though she was, to use a phrase from elsewhere in Dictée, born of one mother and one father. As a vessel for holy parturition, Mary was preserved from all stain. She is sinless. She is full of grace. I read Cha as the she who would have been voted to crown the Blessed Virgin. She herself, Theresa, would be sinless, and she would also be silent far too often. In this, I read Cha's longing as well as her self-perception. The relation between the she and the Blessed Virgin here is the founding relation between she and her that is core to Dictée, that runs through its rites. The second translation exercise, it's right here. The second translation exercise recites the Catholic prayer of contrition. I detest all my sins. And the eighth, it's up there. The eighth details the rite of confession. Name all the sins, get the penance, say thank you, Father. But when Cha enters the confessional, and here she is entering the confessional, she is already sinless. And so though she rehearses her lines, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, my last confession was, I can't remember when, these are my sins, her true confession is that I am making up the sins for the guarantee of absolution. In the beginning again at zero, before heaven even, before the fall, all previous wrongs erased, reduced to spotless, pure, when I receive God, all pure. She confesses her sinlessness, and then she can rewind back to before the Catholic cosmology of heaven and the fall to receive God, all pure. She makes up the sins, and in her act of contrition, she confesses, and that is here. Okay, sorry. She confesses that I am making the confession, which builds to a glorious catechism. Sorry, it's here. God who has made me in his own likeness, in his own image, in his own resemblance, in his own copy, in his own counterfeit presentment, in his duplicate, in his own reproduction, in his cast, in his carbon, his image and his mirror, pleasure in the image, pleasure in the copy, pleasure in the projection of likeness, pleasure in the repetition. This confession claims her likeness to God, but in proliferating techniques of reproduction, cast, carbon, and I would add the photocopy, the film. This reproduction, God making me, is conception without sin, and it permits pleasure. Pleasure in the image, its repetition and projection. The founding condition of being like God permits the pleasures of creation, which bear all of the hallmarks of Cha's art, the image, the copy, the cinema. But this creative divinity is also the work of giving over. Sorry, it's like in the corner here. Acquiesce to the correspondence. But it keeps going there. Acquiesce to the messenger. Acquiesce to and for the complot in the hieratic tongue. Theirs, into their tongue, the counterscript, my confession in theirs, into theirs, to scribe, to make hear the words, to make sound the words made flesh. She acquiesces not to God, but to the correspondence. The pleasure born from likeness compels acquiescence to and for the complot, a French word meaning conspiracy, into theirs. Though she is not subject to heaven or the fall, she must acquiesce to the hieratic tongue, priestly speech, to make their words flesh. The word dictée itself, of course, names the labor of composing into their tongue. This book is founded in this tension between the pleasures and strictures of creation. The correspondence, I'm sorry, it's like cut off. See the end of correspondence, right? This is actually a French word in the text because it's spelled D-A-N-C-E, if you remember that Derrida business, correspondence, okay? Bears the labor of dictée. What she achieves in claiming her identity to God affects a translation into terms that are not her own. And so, after her confession, we see that dictée is embedded within these rituals. Yes. Okay, right there. Okay. See, you knew it, Syd. Okay. All right. Okay. First Friday, 1 hour before Mass. Mass every first Friday. Dictée first. Every Friday before Mass. Dictée before. Back in the study hall. The Ash Wednesday Mass concludes with crowning Mary. That's all in here. And then the Novena of the Immaculate Conception here. And then the 9 days of devotion, right? And this famously, and it begins, right? Okay. The days that follow feature multiple correspondences, family letters, political petitions, to found letters about missing persons. To make these words flesh is to, quote, scribe in their tongue. So to be sinless is still to suffer the pains of giving birth. The devotion of the artist is to labor to bring forth these others. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for organizing this and for bringing all these poets in the room to celebrate this amazing book. So, Kathy Park Hong has said that while reading Dictée, the reader is a detective, puzzling out her connections. And I think that gets to the heart of why I love this book. I've been puzzling out the connections since I first read it in the 1990s, and the countless times I've read it since, and I still feel like I'm mapping new discoveries and ways to read it. The muse of the, so those of you who have read the book know that it's a good part of it is organized around the 9 muses. So the muse of the Clio Histories section is Yu Guan-soon, a teenage activist who in 1919 participated in the March 1st movement protests against the Japanese occupation of Korea. While demonstrating in her hometown, her parents were killed and she was put in jail, where she was tortured and ultimately died, becoming a martyr figure for the Korean independence movement. This image of Yu Guan-soon appears without caption or citation, as is the case for all of the images in the book. Dictée was originally published in 1982 by Tandem Press and was essentially ignored for a decade, too ahead of its time. But when it was reprinted in 1994 by Third Woman Press, it became legendary. Timothy Yu has written about the reasons for this shift in reception in his essay, Theresa Hakyang Cha and the Impact of Theory, and I recommend checking that out. My copy is the 1990s edition, which I'm happy to see has been returned in the most recent edition. It went through some other variations. So I bring this up because this copy was designed by Cha, and it includes an element that wasn't available in the some of the editions that followed. This image appears on the original back cover. And the detective reader can see that it provides a larger context for the cropped image of Yu Guan-sun. So, right there. In this image, there are 9 girls, echoing the number of the 9 muses. And from my 21st century detective reader position, with the help of Google Lens, I can locate the entirety of the photo used in Dictée. Here. And this is a school photo from 1918, a year before Yu Guan-sun's death, and there are in fact 12 girls. This is just one example of how throughout Dictée, images, words, and forms echo and reformulate, creating vibrational ripples as patterns shift and realign. Documentary poetics, I'm kind of in the way. Documentary poetics is a recontextualizing gesture that allows us to see the documents that shape history and our lives from different angles. The way documents are used in a work like Dictée, cut up, written into, put in relation, destabilizes their certainties, physicalizes their hurts, and disrupts their harms. Throughout the Clio history section, Cha's retelling of Yu Guan-sun's story is intermixed with documents, including quotations from Fred Arthur Mackenzie's 1908 book, The Tragedy of Korea, an excerpt from a 1907 article from the Korean Daily News, and a letter from the Koreans of Hawaii written to Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 and signed by Syngman Rhee, who was later installed by the U.S. in 1948 as the first president of the Republic of Korea, and whose overthrow was the result of the 1960 student uprising, which is described later in the book in the tragedy section. Laced between these documentary artifacts is a critique of the neutralizing effects of the language of information. Quote, neutralize to achieve the no response, to make absorb, to submit to the unidirectional correspondence. Cha is splicing, editing, and glitching these materials so they become part of a network of relation, a network of response. Toward the end of the section, we return to the story of Yu Guan-sun and her arrest and martyrdom. We read, some will not know age, some not age. Time stops. Time will stop for some, for them especially. Eternal time, no age. Time fixes for some. Their image, the memory of them, is not given to deterioration, unlike the captured image that extracts from the soul precisely by reproducing, multiplying itself. Their countenance evokes not the hallowed beauty, beauty from seasonal decay, evokes not the inevitable, not death, but the dying. For the most part, the prose is stuttery, fragmentary, and time stops momentarily with each punctuation mark before breath and voice and articulation start again. The last pages of the section are a 2-page spread, another document, a copy of a handwritten draft. Oops, thank you. Thank you, Syd. So the last pages of the section are a 2-page spread, another document, a copy of a handwritten draft that presumably preceded the typeset paragraph we just read. Similar to the cropped school photo, Cha gives us a clue to what came before. History, like this text, is something that is drafted, redacted, recropped, rewritten again and again. She's showing the process. but something that appears in the final printed version that is not available in the draft is the very unstuttery and polished line. Their image, the memory of them, is not given to deterioration, unlike the captured image that extracts from the soul precisely by reproducing, multiplying itself. I think back to the 1990s when I was in grad school, and everyone I knew seemed to be reading Dictée and Walter Benjamin's Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction at the same time. I think about how a copy is a document where the aura of lived experience has been removed. I think about how this page spread is a copy of a copy, and how the book as a whole tries to bring lived experience back into the document through recontextualization, recombination, and parataxis. If I were to distill the complexity of this book to one question that Cha is asking, it would be, who am I, and how did things come to be this way? In the Cleo section, she tries to answer by sorting through the filing cabinet of history. She is the detective, and the only moments of truth are in that vibration between document and confabulation. Thanks.
Hi everyone. I'll be talking about the Calliope epic poetry section. Upon opening to the first pages of Calliope epic poetry, I'm faced with the juxtaposition of a grainy photograph of a young Korean woman and the beginning of a letter written to a mother. The woman in the photograph and the mother addressed is Hyung Soon-ho, Theresa Kyung-cha's mother. The letter addresses the figure in the photograph who would eventually become the writer's mother, but writes about the time at which the photograph was likely taken. Cha writes, "Mother, you are 18 years old." Both image and text embody temporal leaps, as the photograph makes a moment from the past immediately visible here and now. The use of present tense also renders the past present. Curiously, Cha tells her mother's own life back to her. "You were born in Yeongjong, Manchuria, and this is where you now live. You are not Chinese, you are Korean." Such telling seems less necessary for the intended reader of the letter and more informative to the reader of Dictée, positioned somewhere between the writing and the reading of the letter, of its composition, delivery, and maybe even its imagined reply. The text later reveals that the year is 1940, and her mother's parents had fled Korea during the Japanese occupation, only to see it spread to China as well, where they are forced to speak in Japanese even to other Koreans. They are refugees, immigrants, exiles, both geographically and linguistically displaced. While these designations indicate their status of non-belonging, the letter retroactively projects motherhood onto the photograph of a girl separated from her motherland and forbidden to speak her mother tongue, calling attention to the gendered and familial connotations of these terms for native country and language. As Cha writes later in the section, "Mother, inseparable from which is her identity, her presence." Cha writes of her mother's youth as if she were there, as if she herself witnessed it. She writes to her as if seeing from her mother's perspective, almost as if the second person you could be read as a first person I instead. You speak the tongue, the mandatory language like the others. It is not your own, even if it is not, you know you must. She seems to inhabit her mother's past experiences, even as she continues to draw attention to her narrating position outside of it. Of course, she wasn't there in the past, but she accesses her mother's history through textual traversal. As one of the endnotes of Dictée indicates, Cha gathered the biographical material for this section from her mother's journal. As such, Cha is a mediator who merges a telling with a retelling through an epistolary biographical mode. In what feels like a textual sleight of hand, Cha blurs the edges between source material and written product, the representation of a mother's life refracted through her daughter's retrospective lens, the mother's writing both there and not there. Having been born in Manchuria, her mother has no memory of Korea at this point. She is primarily tethered to her motherland through her mother tongue. Cha correlates language with belonging and identity. Mother tongue is your refuge. It is being home, being who you are. Yet Cha uses English to recount her mother's history. Despite her palpable longing to use the Korean language, it remains absent throughout most of the book. The page introduces one of the only Korean words that appear in Dictée, aside from the etched text in the image that precedes the title page. Yet this word is not even in Hangul. It is transliterated into English. Its stark capitalization stamping the center of the page seems to invite the reader to say it out loud, perhaps even insists on it. Here, I'm made acutely aware of my position as reader because when I read off the page, I feel the difference between the open vowel sound of the second syllable and my own pronunciation of the word maum. The English spelling presents an imperfect transliteration, as all transliterations inevitably are. It's unable to direct a precise reading of the Korean word, which Cha briefly describes as spirit heart, though the word has no fitting English equivalent translation either. Maum, a word that encompasses heart, mind, and will altogether. The difficulty in translating it also makes more obvious the fact that this entire epistolary biography, in and of itself, is also an act of translation, given that her mother's journal was presumably not written in English. Just as the presence of the U bears resonance of an I, the primarily English text holds Korean under its visible surface. Again, both there and not there. In addition to the inherent doubleness of the text, I'm also struck by the symmetries and inversions of the photographs, narratives, and second-person address in Calliope epic poetry. While much of this section is devoted to narrating her mother's life, the latter pages turn to Cha's own experience of displacement as a Korean-American immigrant. Pages 48 and 56 begin similarly. You write, you speak, later echoed by I write you, daily. The act of writing is shared across time, across parallel trajectories. Upon Cha's return to Korea with documents that indicate her American citizenship, she confronts the visual and linguistic frictions that mark her difference from other Koreans, despite being native to the same motherland. The authorities in uniform interpolate Cha as foreigner. They comment on your inability or ability to speak, whether you are telling the truth or not about your nationality. They say you look other than you say. Here too, though not referring to her mother this time, the you carries the autobiographical charge of an I. The same designations attributed to her mother, refugee, immigrant, exile, now apply to Cha as well. The documents, with their signifying power, sealed with emblems of the US, render her American, distancing her from her Korean identity, establishing a strict division between the past and present, between who she was before and after, as in citizenship makes the difference, the rest is past. This contrasts the notion of time presented earlier in the section as a phenomenon that is not only linear and sequential, but layered. Rather than existing as discrete moments in time, for Cha, the present is a palimpsest that bears traces of the past. As she writes to her mother, but your maum, spirit, has not left, never shall have and never shall will, not now, not even now. It is burned into your ever-present memory, memoryless, because it is not in the past, it cannot be. In this sense, memories are immediate embodied realities carried continuously in and through the present. This document, that is Cha's letter to her mother then, serves as an alternate document, proof, evidence of a lived history that insists upon the presence of the past. This is set against those documents that decree her citizenship, which demand the erasure of her past in exchange for an identity aligned only to one nation. No before, only and after. While official documents limit her to a single status, either citizen or foreigner, Cha's epistolary of the past as present carries her and her mother's layered histories. By the end of the section, The you and the I seem to further blend together, the voice of the mother and daughter indistinguishable from each other. When the text reads, "You open your mouth halfway, near tears, nearly saying, 'I know you, I know you. I have waited to see you for long, this long.'" I'm no longer certain whether the I is Cha translating her mother or Cha vocalizing that which she could not actually say in the moment of interrogation. Perhaps it's both. Though they occurred at different periods in time, these parallel personal histories evoke a shared maum between mother and daughter through the inflection of the I in the you and recognition of the you in the I. This letter composes discrete memories of transnational crossings and the grief of living in perpetual states of exile as a shared past that is always present. Thank you.
Is this yours? Thanks so much, Joe, for inviting me. It's great to be among such lovely company. I will admit, though, that when you asked me if I wanted to speak about Dictée at this event, I experienced a mild feeling of mild panic. My relationship to Dictée is so visceral that it is almost impossible to come up with words to describe it. I've been trying to remember who suggested I read Dictée and how old I was and where I was when I first opened up the book, but I can't quite grasp those details. What I can grasp and still hold dearly is the intense and bodily, emotional, and intellectual stimulation I felt opening the book for the first time, a kind of general awestruckness that hasn't left me, that still leaves me pretty speechless. A deeply internal sense that this is the way books should be written, utterly open and utterly opaque, always fierce and meticulously structured, that this is how I want to write books. I felt it when I read the book in my 20s, and I feel it every time I open the book again to teach it or open my own notebook to write. I find it pretty impossible to teach Dictée, so I have students free write their way through it, drawing on writing as a way of thinking strategies that the inimitable Joan Rotalick originally came up with at Bard. I'll put a text like M. Norbese Phillips' Discourse on the Logic of Language next to Dictée and ask students to write about contact zones and language as anguish. I'll ask students to write about what Cha calls in one artist statement, looking for the roots of the language before it is born on the tip of the tongue. And we'll write about Cha's focus on the audience in her work, on what she calls producing multiple telling with multiple offering. We'll write through questions together towards a kind of thinking that is also a kind of feeling our way, stopping and starting again. And we'll let the book be what it is in its performance, not focus on trying to capture and interpret a fundamentally fugitive text. You may guess that close reading in the English literature sense is not really my bag. I'm more of an associative gleaner, pulling at disparate threads to create a cacophony, awkward non sequitur fully intended. Joe asked us to pick a passage and riff on it, and I'll start with my favorite spread in the book, pages 74 and 75. On the left, page 74, there's a reproduction of a page perhaps taken from a medical textbook, showing 4 views of the anatomy required to breathe and speak. On the right page of the spread is a kind of translation of the images on the left, showing how a tongue and speech can be broken and cracked in so many ways in the complex process from trachea to larynx to the adduction of vocal folds for phonation. Cha describes the stops, starts, contraction, noise of a semblance of speech that she calls pigeon, like the bird, in one of her interesting orthographic errors, intentional or not. Indeed, Dictée, deliberately spelled without the accent aigu, enacts its own pigeon that the reader must struggle to understand as they swim through Dictée's air passages and encounter many stops, starts, contractions, and noise. The reader becomes a dictee, sounding out the proffered words, a disuse, plunging into disuse as they navigate a text that enacts Edouard Glissant's right to obscurity, a text that you can't comprehend, take and know and use and deploy, which is of course what makes the text so desirable. I recently read an essay by a poet critic who claimed to have produced a definitive reading of Dictée, and I laughed out loud while feeling intensely claustrophobic in the face of his certainty, his closing of the open. Page 75 also enacts a stoppage of breath, a sudden arrest that becomes a rest, that becomes a probation of rest, probation's etymological origins being a trial, experiment, test, act of examining with a probe. And I imagine a probe thrust down the passageways of the throat on the left, whether that improper probation be Japanese colonialism in Korea, U.S. colonialism within and without its fictive borders, or another occupying and murdering rapist in the basement of a lower Manhattan building. I want to pull that probe out from Dictée's airways, but can't. All I can do is stay and listen and gather both lips and mimic the speaking that might resemble speech, anything at all, bared noise, groans, bits torn from words, which is from page 3 in Dictée, the section entitled Des yeux, another favorite part for me, and a section that the page 74-75 spread is hearkening back to. An anonymous, gender-neutral it murmurs inside, here at the beginning of Dictée, not unlike Maurice Blanchot's neutral murmur of contestation, an inside that holds the speech of not saying, that holds the speech of saying. In my mind, the it of page 3 shows up on 75 in an invisible way, how the sounds that move at a time and the exceptions stops and starts again instead of stop and start again. The it stops and starts again. It murmurs. Page 75 murmurs again at the end of the book on page 158, 159 as, oops. Speech perhaps, or noise, or semblance of noise, starts again, maimed, almost a name, all stop start. How vast this page, stillness the page, then once more the page being broken, speaking broken. The wound, liquid, dusk, must break, must void. When I recall the feeling of first picking up this book Dictée, I hold its wounded words in my body. They are sharp. Such words are what drew me into its pages, the possibility of saying what can't be said, speaking into and out of the wound wound, not unlike how Norbese Philip Zong speaks within and through the womb abyss of the Atlantic, cracking and breaking and failing and drowning. Then a pause and a rest, gasping inhale and exhale, breath stopping and starting once more, vocal folds, murmuring an uncanny semblance of noise, a dangerous perhaps of speech. This is how and why I write. And Cha and Norbese Philip and Paul Celan and Edmond Jabez and other broken open no ones demonstrated that peut-être for me, that sense of something, some monstrous it, always becoming impossible. One last thing about the page 74, 75 spread. When I opened Dictée to these pages for the 100th time in order to start thinking about writing this piece, I noticed that my relationship to the spread had changed since I started taking hormones. I'm now keenly aware that my voice is changing as I speak, that it is becoming deeper, that it sometimes breaks like some pimply adolescent boy, that it may not end up sounding the way I wish it would, filling the airways below the flesh of my newly sculpted breastbone. That for all my desire to stop and start again and begin perceptively to become some other presentation, I may have to accept a probation of rest, vocal folds adducting, abducting, murmuring in a void of their own making before being born on the tip of my tongue. And I know I can do this because the Des yeux has done it before me.
Thank you so much to Joe for convening this. Thank you so much to all my co-conspirators in this event. All right, I'll begin with this one. I opened my battered copy of Dictée again after first encountering it in graduate school in Elizabeth Willis's class about poetry and visual cultures. And this time I noticed the bold type on page 121, centered and split by a big gap. Elitare lyric poetry. The book's explicit reference to lyric utterance rends the title at just the very point it names its lyric muse. And the muse does not actually exist. Most people call the muse of lyric Euterpe. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Euterpe is the patron of tragedy or flute playing, one or the other. Melpomene is the muse of tragedy too, and she appears in the TOC for Dictée. Euterpe is also a genus of fruit and palm trees and berries. But Theresa Cha does not invoke Euterpe. She calls her lyric muse Elitare. Elitare is a muse who does not exist, except in the pages of Dictée. Is elitare a neologism, combining the words elite and literature, as Shelley Sun Wang suggests? Is she a pun on the French words elitaire, which can be translated into English as she iterates or she repeats, as He Jung Serenity Jew and Christina Lux suggest? Is elitare something else also, maybe a homophonic or visual riff on any number of words like tear, leader, alight, lit? The etymology of the French word élite includes the words selection or choice. So is elitare a little bit like saying, I choose my own muse? I've seen the muse elitare described as an error in Dictée, but Dictée is full of errors. The error of history, the error of identification, the error of utterance. An error is not necessarily an accident. It can be a tool or a weapon. Susan Howe writes in her book, The Birthmark, assurances, citations, expressions, dams, figments, errors, echolalic slivers are emblazoned ciphers of inspiration. Theresa Cha writes in Dictée, to name it now so as not to repeat history in oblivion, to extract each by each fragment from the word, from the image, another word, another image, the reply that will not repeat history in oblivion. Oblivion is mythological too. It's what happens when you lose your muse, your inspiration, your breathing of an idea when you drink from the river Lethe. And Lethe is the name of a goddess who is also a kind of muse. So maybe elitare is absent from any other text besides Dictée because she's a kind of oblivion, come back into this text in grainy black and white. Earlier in Dictée, Cha writes about the revolutionary Guan and how the captured image of martyrdom stops time. She writes about people and faces like the ones in the blurry, low-resolution black and white photographs that appear throughout Dictée, including the one of the crowd that opens the lyric section. And she writes about the way a missing memory can give rise to a new form. She writes, this is actually from earlier in the book, face to face with the memory, it misses, it's missing, still what of time does not move, remains there, misses nothing, time that is, all else, all things else, all other subject to time, must answer to time except stillborn, aborted, barely, infant, seed, germ, sprout, less even, dormant, stagnant, missing, the decapitated forms, worn, marred, recording a past of previous forms, the present form face to face, reveals the missing, the absent, would be said remnant, memory, but the remnant is the whole. Seed, germ, sprout, muse of fruit and palm trees, the muse of lyric, the missing, aborted, or stillborn muse, oblivion. Elitare is a fiction, an error, a chosen error, a would-be said, a barely, a present form, a remnant, a decapitated form, reformed to hold space for this text's speech, its disuse, its painful grammar and punctuation. Is she meant to reassemble remnants suppressed during Japan's occupation of Korea? As Cha writes, everyone knows to carry inside themselves the national flag. Everyone knows equally the punishment that follows this gesture. Elitary lyric is titled after this muse, but the first poem in this section invokes the Dicteuse as a fortune teller, able to break spells. Dead time, hollow depression interred, invalid to resurgence, resistant to memory, waits, appel, appellation, excavation. Let the one who is Dicteuse, Dicteuse de Bonaventure, let her call forth. Let her break open the spell, cast upon time again and again, with her voice penetrate earth's floor, the walls of Tartarus, to circle and scratch the bowl's surface. Let the sound enter from without, the bowl's hollow, its sleep until. Appel, a truncated version of appel or cry. Appellation, from a cry to a name. Dicteuse de Bonaventure, the weight from pain to say. Another goddess, sometimes called Fortuna or an oracle. Tartarus, the underworld here on earth, hell here on earth, and until, a fragment ending the stanza, asking us to wait. Elitary lyric poetry ends with an image of a hand. Another grainy black and white image suggesting a hand on the surface of Earth's floor or the walls of Tartarus, or maybe the wall of the mine that has words scratched on it earlier in the book. At first I read this image as a hand on a page, but of course that was too literal. It's just a hand printed on the page of my book. It could be a hand on any surface reproduced on this page. There are lots of cracks and lines which might be in the original or might be the effects of the reproduction. Seed, germ, sprout, less even, a hand reaching out or marking the spot, 5 fingers in a palm that also say stop. Cha writes later, you remain dismembered. This dismembered hand is also a decapitated form that is also a whole, a fragment like an imagined muse. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say thank you. This went beyond my wildest dreams. So thank you to all of you. But if I was saying, well, if you guys want to riff out there, but you have any questions about? I'll start with you, Jena. What kind of detective are you?
I'm really good at using Google. Anybody can do it. Are we talking with the audience now? Yeah. Is that so? Does anyone have anything to add? I mean, I don't know how many people in here are reading the book for the first time, or what? Yeah. Any thoughts? I mean, I feel like we're in this kind of very beautiful version of a book club. Right. And so really any kind of thoughts about Dictée are welcome, or questions, or, I mean, it's a book that changes all the time, which I think all of these talks spoke to. You can read into it endlessly. I'm going to pass the mic. Unless anybody has.
Who has a question?
Hi. Thank you for that. So I am wondering about, you just said that this is a book that changes all the time. And I'm wondering, what are some ways that the book has changed? I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about Dictée is that it comes out just at a moment that people are beginning to sort of think about a canon for Asian American literature or Asian literature in the United States. And so the Dictée is not in the tradition of something that feels like an explainer. It's avant-garde. And I'm wondering about the way that people read the book or talk about the book has changed in the time, in the last, in its life.
Yeah, go read the Timothy Yu. But, it's super interesting. So when it first came out in 1982, which was on the, just before horrifying things happened to Theresa Kyung, and its reception was actually, like, I read some of those early pieces, and it did all like the myth of Demeter and Persephone. There were those kinds of like mythical method type readings of the book. And the 1994 Writing Self, Writing Nation, that became a kind of companion to Dictée. And that's when I discovered it at Berkeley. That was kind of like a Berkeley faculty kind of production. That's when you read it at Berkeley. And I feel like then it became this like Asian American text, but I don't know that it was before. And I think it's everybody's book, obviously. Like I don't, but it is very interesting how it belongs to Asian America. And I won't put Indy on the spot, but we've talked a bit about, how it as like an ethnic text or, or even how it might be resituated in, sorry, I am going to talk about Indy, like situated in the kind of its theoretical moment, which I think has been kind of less done. But I think there's so many contexts for it now. And I think one thing that some scholars point out is when you situate it as an Asian American text, not that everyone does this, but they read just the first half of the book. Because the second half is not really, whatever, who cares? There's no explanatory framework for it anyway, right? I think that's Syd's extraordinary presentation, really. But I think it can help you through the first half, but it's not, whatever. It's like, and, it's interesting to think about Theresa Kyung as an Asian American. So, I've looked at some of her writing. There's this, I'm not your Yoko Ono. There's some of that kind of, and the way she sort of revised that out of some of her writing, which I also find fascinating. So, it's who she was, but the vocabulary for it is very different from what we might use now. So I want just the book to be, I'm going to cite Syd again, like utterly open and utterly closed, right? Like sometimes I don't like those frameworks, honestly.
More questions? There's a question.
Hi, thank you all for this. I was really excited to get the email about this on the calendar. I first encountered Dictée in undergrad because I was spending a lot of time with Kathy Acker's work, and I was really resistant. I was obsessed with Blood and Guts in high school, and I was spending a lot of time with that, and I was really, a lot of the texts that I was reading about it were calling it a novel, and I was like, well, no, it's not a novel. And I was really upset about that. And my favorite professor recommended me to read Dictée based on that. So I was really excited when basically the first thing that you mentioned today was that you were not going to call Dictée a novel. So I guess I was wondering about just thoughts on the terms book versus novel, maybe the limitations of the book form. I don't know, I guess just kind of a very open-ended question about the physical object of the book and maybe how that could either limit this work or how maybe the work allows us to imagine a different life for a book object.
Yeah, I think I think of it as a performance, and if you think of Cha's work, people don't talk a lot about her performances. Like that's her that was her main thing that she was doing, was various different performances. And I was even thinking when Julia was speaking, that section that you were reading, there was the reference to the bowl and the water, and there's actually, she has a video that is doing work with the bowl and the water, and I thought, oh, I forgot to say that to you before. Yeah, Jesus, fuck. But yeah, like that it's, oh yeah, and so then, sorry, can I see the book for a sec? So that I really like in the section, Elizabeth and I were talking about how this is impossible to show on a PDF, but this section, how, for me, this reads like a film. So where and the spreads, but she has another book. Sorry, I didn't like go into my dusty archive of my brain, but of all my Cha stuff. But there's the book, is Apparatus? Is that what it is? Yeah, where she does other sort of filmic things with words, and so yeah, I don't know. I kind of think of that as it's like, it's something that helps us think beyond genre, because if anything's tired, it's genre, you know. So it explodes the book in the way like Zong explodes the book, and yet it still has, like, it's still very structured and really deliberate. Like that section I was just talking about, it's like deliberately, those spreads are very deliberately folded upon each other, and yeah, I mean, I'm just saying her work is the mark of someone is much bigger than the book, and in all of her iterations. I think someone has their hand up over there.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add to, or follow up on what Joe was talking about, which was we've been talking about the performance, or the context for Cha's art and performance art in San Francisco in the late 70s, and how all those different forms coalesce in the book, as you were saying. But the other thing I've been thinking about is book art, which is something that she made and exhibited, like book objects, or the conceptual art as well as the performance art and film. And there was a reading of Dictée in Berkeley a couple of years ago where they were talking a lot about mail art as something that Cha produced. So these note cards it was a piece called Audience Distant Relative, and it was all about sending letters to unknown recipients, and that as a frame for reading the letters. So thinking about, even when you were talking about that letter, the you at the end of that letter being an address to the mother, there is also a way in which it's an address to the reader. And so that's just various different ways that I've been thinking about Cha's artistic career as feeding into this in a way that situates it in an American San Francisco context. Yeah. Okay. That's it.
I'm just gonna go back to Molly's question a little bit about the book, because I think that, like Syd was saying, the book is just one part of a larger art practice. In fact, I think in some ways, I think about a writer, artist, performer like Caroline Bergvall, as all of her projects are kind of, speaking to the same obsessions or themes, but using different methods. And I think that Dictée was just one way that Cha was addressing, the things that she's working with in other mediums. But I think for poetry, at least I'm just speaking for myself, it announced possibilities that I didn't know existed before when I first read it, and just really broke everything open. because it is a poem. I could see how people would say it's a novel. Some people say it's so many things, because it's so open to readership. And that's all I can say. Yeah.
Can you I think I'm loud, but okay. Can you talk a little bit more about what it opened for you? And actually, if all of you could talk about that, that would be so interesting to me. Thank you.
I mean, you talked about it in your...
I'm just trying to thinking. It's so hard to put. It's a great question, and it's hard to articulate. I mean, one thing that I was struck in preparing and some of our comments, there's this intense vulnerability I find in talking about the book. It's really uncomfortable because what the book means in my lived experience, like carrying it around like a talisman, and that process of being broken open, encountering something new. I don't really have words to explain what that is, but I know that it's been formative for me, and I know that there isn't any other book that is like Dictée. There just isn't. So I don't know. I can't say more, but maybe others can.
Well, for me, the first time I ever read Dictée was in college, and it was the first book by a Korean American writer that I had ever read, or that was ever assigned to me in a class. And so what it broke open for me was, oh, someone like this can write a book like this. We were talking a little bit about how, much of the book isn't autobiographical, and the edition of the book that I happen to be carrying with me right now has a cover of Theresa Cha's mother on it. And, that can be questionable for a lot of reasons. But when I read the book, the autobiographical quality was the thing that drew me to it, because I also am Korean American. However, I think what really captivated me about the book is that, someone was asking the question about the physicality of the book and being a book object. I think the kind of reading that this book invites is so different from others in that it invites the reader to kind of flip back and forth. When we read one word, it calls back to another that we read earlier. And I find that whenever I'm reading the book, I'm holding my fingers in so many pages at once and trying to make all the connections. And, even the later sections that seem to be doing a lot of interesting things with form, they also call back to the sections that, have more content related to, Korean history and the Japanese occupation. And so all the aspects of form and content are sort of linked together. And so I think, Laynie, you had asked the question, what is reading? And Jena, you kind of talked about how the book's main question seems to be, who am I and how did I get here, or something like that. And another question I hear from the book is, how are you reading? Because the book kind of requires the reader to do so much more than just go from beginning to end. It kind of requires that like shifting back and forth and kind of shuffling between the pages.
Yeah, I really love what you just said, and it echoes some of my own experience first encountering it, which I think I'm remembering it as somewhat frantic because I found myself going back and forth between different pages. And it was certainly the first book length. I think of it as a book length poem or a long poem, and it was certainly the first work like that I think I possibly had ever read. I'm not sure I had read anything else that one might call a long poem or a book length poem before this one, although it's often been compared to other works that fall under that genre category. And I think you used the word glitch in your presentation, and that I think captures my own experience of reading it. Even now, there's something, I'm not actually a particularly visual person in general. I'm a very word and language person, but there's something about this text that invites my eye to sort of glitch and look away and look again and hunt around for the patterns and let the patterns fall apart. And so now I'm talking about like the texture of the poems, but I think there is something about the book object that really spoke to me for the first time as a poet. And then I went on to think about it for the next 20 years.
Yeah, I think Laynie captured nicely like what happens at the opening of the book. Like when you have a book object in your hand, you generally open to the beginning. And I know for myself, I think the beginning was like the first words were just super powerful for me. And at the time when I read it, like in the 80s or whatever, it was just like all that you were saying about the punctuation and that it's, just what it was, and for me, like what it was doing about, I think it might have been one of the first books that talked however figuratively about writing, like about coming to writing or coming to speech, and then, metaphorically in your mind you come to writing as a writer or whatever. So it was that right, and it was right from the first page, right, and it made it also laid out, like that stuff what you're talking about with the commas and writing out the commas and then the errors, and it was just, it becomes like, I guess it was of that time, that was the time of like starting into high theory when I was reading it, but I had no idea about theory at all. But it's that idea though of that language like makes something happen, and it really, for me, that's what it became. It was like an emotional thing. It was, so I'm not being very articulate because I already did the best I could earlier.
So the question was, how did it break things open?
For you.
For me? I mean, I'm just going to repeat what others have said, I think. Long poem, including like so many different kinds of materials. The errors were very... I'm very interested in errors kind of showing the way. It's, what's that? Wandering. I mean, this is great. It's just like an ever generative text. There's no way to read it and be like, I got it, and it just every time, it's something new, and I just love that.
So my response is a lot like Elizabeth. So I felt, first of all, it's so weird that she's buried near my grandma. Like, that was really weird. And I didn't even remember that until like for this. I was like, oh yeah, the first time I encountered her was through this like headstone. It was very weird.
How did you initially find out?
Oh, so I was visiting my grandmother's cemetery, and my aunt was like, oh look, there's a famous Korean, and I was like, whatever, filed away, so yeah, it's a very beautiful, serene place actually. But I think my identification was bizarrely powerful, just because I was at Berkeley, where that's where her archive is, and I'm Korean. My grandmother's buried near her, and then I also was I was in Comp Lit, and one of my languages was French, so I was like reading. It was like weird, like the connection. But I don't like to identify, and I hate poignant things. So it was actually like awful. Like, I didn't want to feel the way this, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't, and I want to be like hard, I want to study hard, recondite thing, and I was like, oh, but this is hard, but I feel it. It was actually, I don't know, and I did not write on it, and my dissertation was on like Ezra Pound, you know what I mean? And then, but like later on, like it that was the end point actually of my project. It ended up going there, and then I still feel very, and I was always like looking to see what she looked like. I was just dying. I don't know. Do you guys like, what does she look like? And there was a recent New York Times piece on her where they had this full color photograph of her in the 1970s. I was like, that feels like a violation. I did not want to see that color photo of her, really. you know, and I just, and like the pictures of her sister Bernadette, which you think is her, you know, yeah, yeah, it's just so, yeah, for like 1 second, yeah. Yeah, I love like looking for her, not find that, you know, like that. I'm interested in that because it's just so, I feel uncomfortable with the identification. This is also why I say, you know, these ethnic frameworks have their limitations because I'm uncomfortable, you know, with them.
Yeah, right? It's so interesting that you're like chasing her and yet uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like, what she elicits within you. Like that's that is so interesting.
Yeah. I also almost never teach the book because I'm so uncomfortable with it.
I guess
But
that means you should.
yeah,
This is what you're resisting. There's something there.
I only taught it once.
You should teach it.
But
Well-
it's also funny because you're like, I want to hard. What is harder than dictate?
Well, hard bad things like Ezra. So maybe we will. I think we've hit 7. We've all shared too much, so I think we're good. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.